The heavy brass-rimmed thermos rattled against the stainless steel table of the observation deck, a sound that seemed to echo with unnatural violence through the silent, pressurized chamber. Outside the reinforced viewports of the Highland Beacon, the moon Sigma, known colloquially by the human contractors as the Iron Moor, stretched out in a bruised palette of oxidized oranges and sickly metallic violets. It was a landscape that looked remarkably like a fever dream version of the Scottish Highlands, if the Scottish Highlands were actively trying to dissolve the calcium from your bones. Dr. Xun, a lead biologist whose crystalline skin hummed with a faint, anxious lavender light, watched the man sitting across from him. The man, Elias Thorne, was currently engaged in an act that Xun's medical scanners classified as a slow-motion suicide attempt. Elias had unscrewed the cap of his thermos, releasing a plume of steam that smelled of charred earth and bitter tannins. He then proceeded to pour a dark, viscous liquid into a chipped ceramic mug. "Mr. Thorne," Xun's voice chimed. The sound translated from crystalline vibrations into a melodic synthetic English. "My internal sensors are registering a grade 4 neurotoxin alert from your beverage. The concentration of caffeine and tannins alone is enough to induce cardiac arrest in 80% of the Galactic Union's known sentient species. Why are you ingesting it?" Elias didn't look up. He adjusted his flat cap, the wool fabric worn thin at the edges from years of North Sea winds, and took a long, slow draw of the steaming liquid. He exhaled a sigh that sounded like a steam engine cooling down. "It's just English breakfast, doctor. Keeps the blood moving. If I don't have my morning brew, you'll find I'm much more dangerous than the atmosphere out there." Xun's facets dimmed in confusion. "But your planet, Earth. The reports call it a Class 12 Deathworld. We assumed those were diplomatic exaggerations to keep us from colonizing your sectors. Yet, here you are, a laborer drinking poison for recreation before we step into a 1.5G environment where the very air is saturated with heavy metal spores." Elias finally looked up. His eyes were the color of a stormy Atlantic, cold, gray, and deeply tired. "I'm not here for recreation, document. I'm here for the penance. And on Sigma 9 my biology is the only thing that doesn't need a firmware update to survive a bit of damp." Character count for this section: 2,542 total character count. 2,542. The klaxon for the Great Rust season began to moan, a low-frequency vibration that Elias felt in the soles of his heavy, iron-shod boots. It was the sound of the moon's tectonic plates shifting under the tidal pull of the gas giant above, a signal that the atmospheric pressure was about to surge. "Time to earn the bread," Elias muttered, standing up, while Xun and researcher Vol, a telepathic, liquid-based organism contained within a high-pressure translucent suit, struggled to maintain their footing as the gravity stabilizers began to flicker. Elias stood like an oak. To him, the sudden increase from the galactic standard of 0.8G to the moon's natural 1.5G felt like putting on a heavy winter coat. His Earth-evolved skeletal structure, built to withstand the crushing depths of the North Sea where he had spent his youth welding pipelines, barely registered the strain. The stabilizers. Vol's thoughts rippled into Elias's mind, a frantic, wet sensation. They are failing. The internal pressure is equalizing with the exterior. We will be crushed. Xun was already on his knees, his crystalline limbs trembling as micro-fissures began to spiderweb across his joints. "Thorne, help!" Elias didn't hesitate. He grabbed Xun under the arms, hoisting the 300-pound scientist as if he were a sack of potatoes. He then hooked his arm through the straps of Vol's containment unit. With a grunt of exertion that made the tendons in his neck stand out like steel cables, Elias marched toward the emergency airlock. The walk was only 20 meters, but for the aliens, it was an eternity of escalating agony. For Elias, it was a Monday morning in Aberdeen. He kicked the manual override lever, a heavy iron bar that had rusted into place. Any of the other cadets or scientists would have needed a hydraulic ram to move it. Elias simply leaned his shoulder into it, his earth-born musculature outputting a level of force that the galactic records considered biologically impossible for a creature of his mass. With a scream of protesting metal, the lever gave way. The airlock hissed shut just as the primary observation deck's viewports shattered under the atmospheric weight. "Welcome to the Iron Moor," Elias rasped, setting the trembling scientists down. "The easy part is over. Now we have to walk." Character count for this section: 2,415 total character count. 4,957. The trek across the moor was a descent into a metallic purgatory. The fog on Sigma 9 wasn't composed of water vapor. It was a thick, swirling soup of iron oxide particles and sentient fungal spores known as the shadow lung. These spores were the moon's primary defense mechanism, microscopic invaders that sought out any porous surface to settle, oxidize, and consume. As they moved through the jagged obsidian ridges that Elias called the crags, the silence was broken only by the rhythmic clanking of Elias's boots and the frantic, wet wheezing of Val's life support pumps. The gravity had now peaked at 1.6 g. Every step for Xun was a battle against his own weight. Why? Xun chimed, his light fading to a dull, bruised gray. Why are you not wearing a filter, Thorn? The spores. They are entering your primary respiratory orifices. Elias adjusted his waxed canvas coat, pulling the collar up against the biting wind. The coat was an ancient thing, heavy and smelling of linseed oil and old smoke. My lungs are used to worse, document. I spent 10 years breathing in welding fumes and salt spray. These spores? They're just a bit of grit. My immune system is probably having a field day trying to figure out if they're edible. He wasn't entirely joking. Internally, Elias could feel a familiar heat in his chest, the adrenaline spike that his species had evolved for survival. On Earth it was a stress response, here it was a chemical shield. His liver and kidneys, evolved to process complex toxins and heavy metals from Earth's industrial age, were working at 300% efficiency. He was, in essence, a living refinery. Look there. Elias pointed with a gloved hand toward a valley filled with glowing violet mist. The backup relay. If we can reach the valve, we can vent the pressure and call for a shuttle. But the mist is thickest there. The shadow lung has formed a pocket. Val's telepathic voice was a mere whisper now. I can feel them, the spores. They are hungry. They sense our energy. They are not just fungi, they are a collective. They will dissolve my suit in minutes. Elias looked at the scientists, then at the valley. He saw the way the purple mist swirled, almost purposefully, toward them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small dented tin. He popped the lid to reveal several thick, dark brown biscuits. Ginger biscuits, Elias said, offering one to Xun. My mother's recipe. They've got enough spice to wake the dead. Character count for this section: 2,612 total character count. 7,569. Xun looked at the biscuit as if it were a fragment of a detonated star. His internal scanner shrieked. Thorn, this ginger. It contains gingerol and shogal. In these concentrations, it is a potent inflammatory agent and a chemical irritant. And the sugar? The glucose levels are astronomical. This is not food. It is a thermochemical battery. Exactly. Elias grinned, a rare, jagged expression that didn't reach his tired eyes. He snapped a biscuit in half and popped it into his mouth. The heat of the ginger hit his tongue, a familiar burn that sent a fresh wave of blood to his extremities. It's a bit of fire for the belly. If you're going to survive the moor, you need to be hotter than the rust. He forced a small piece of the biscuit into Xun's nutrient intake port. The crystalline scientist shuddered violently. His lavender light flared into a blinding neon white. His joints, which had been seizing up, suddenly hissed as the chemical battery of the biscuit forced his metabolism into an overdrive state. I feel as though my internal structures are vibrating at a frequency of molecular agony. Xun shouted, his synthetic voice modulator peaking. That's the spirit, Elias muttered. That's just the feeling of being alive on a Tuesday. They descended into the valley. The shadow lung spores sensed the heat and the movement. They swarmed Elias, coating his canvas coat in a layer of fine violet dust. He could feel the spores trying to find a way into his skin, trying to settle in his eyes. He simply blinked, his thick lashes and the natural oils of his skin providing a barrier that the alien spores found inexplicably repulsive. The gravity in the valley floor was treacherous, fluctuating wildly as the moon's tide passed overhead. A sudden spike hit, the pull surging to nearly 2.0 g for a few seconds. Val's containment suit groaned, the reinforced glass beginning to crack. Xun collapsed, his flared-up energy not enough to counter the sheer physics of the moon. Elias, however, just widened his stance. He felt the weight settle on his shoulders, a familiar pressure that reminded him of the North Sea floor. He reached out and grabbed the scientists, dragging them toward a sheltered obsidian overhang. "Stay here," Elias commanded. "The valve is in the center of that spore pocket. I'm going in alone. You will die." Val's telepathic voice projected a vision of Elias's lungs turning into a solid block of iron oxide. No biological organism can process that much heavy metal. Elias didn't answer. He just adjusted his flat cap, tightened his belt, and walked into the violet clouds. Character count for this section: 2,745 total character count. 10,314 as Elias stepped into the heart of the spore pocket. The world turned a bruised, sightless purple. The air was thick, almost liquid, vibrating with the collective hunger of the shadow lung. He could hear the spores pinging against his coat like microscopic hail. Each breath he took was a gamble. On Earth, his ancestors had survived the Black Death, the smog of the Industrial Revolution, and the radioactive fallout of the resource wars. His lungs were a fortress built by a million years of environmental hostility. The spores entered his respiratory system, but instead of finding a soft, vulnerable host, they encountered a mucosal lining reinforced by a diet of acidic coffee and spicy ginger. His immune system, a violent territorial army of white blood cells, attacked the spores with a ferocity that would have horrified the peaceful, crystalline lifeforms of the Union. To Elias, it felt like a mild chest cold. To the spores, it was an extinction event. He reached the relay station, a tower of rusted alloy that groaned under the atmospheric pressure. The primary valve was located at the base, a wheel of solid steel 3 feet in diameter. It was seized, locked by decades of oxidation and the crushing weight of 2.0 G pressure. Elias gripped the wheel. His leather gloves hissed as the shadow lung tried to eat through them. He ignored it. He closed his eyes, visualizing the deep-sea rigs of his youth. He thought of his crew, the men who hadn't been Deathworlders, the men whose bodies had failed when the pressure hit. This was his penance. He wasn't just turning a valve. He was proving that their sacrifice had meant something. He let out a guttural roar, a sound of pure earth-born defiance that echoed through the metallic fog. His muscles bunched, the fibers straining against the limits of biological endurance. The 2.0 G gravity tried to pull his arms from their sockets, but his bones, denser and more mineralized than any species in the sector, held firm. Kriak. The sound of the valve moving was like a gunshot. Elias didn't stop. He threw his entire weight into the rotation, his heart pounding a frantic 180 beat per minute rhythm, fueled by a massive dump of adrenaline. "Move, you bastard," he hissed through gritted teeth. With a final violent shudder, the valve spun open. A jet of high-pressure, purified nitrogen erupted from the relay, a white pillar of ice that tore through the violet mist like a sword. The shadow lung spores, unable to survive the sudden change in chemistry and pressure, disintegrated into harmless ash. Character count for this section: 2,832 total character count. 13,146 Elias collapsed against the cold, iron-rich earth, his chest heaving. The nitrogen jet continued to roar, clearing the valley and signaling the orbital platform that the relay was active. Slowly, the crushing weight of the atmosphere began to lift as the station's automated stabilizers slaved to the newly opened valve. Under the obsidian overhang, Xun and Val watched in stunned silence. The violet fog was gone, replaced by the stark, orange glow of the Sigma-9 sunset. In the center of the clearing, Elias Thorne sat in the dirt, his flat cap missing, his hair matted with sweat and rust dust. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a man who had just finished a very long, very unpleasant shift at a shipyard. Xun walked toward him, his own lavender light now steady but dim. He looked at the valve, then at Elias's hands. The leather gloves were shredded, the skin beneath raw and stained with iron, but the man wasn't even bleeding. "Thorne," Xun whispered. "The biometric data I am receiving. It is impossible. Your heart rate is already returning to a resting state. Your blood oxygen levels are rising despite the lack of a suit. You just performed a task that should have required a Class A industrial exoskeleton." Elias reached into his coat and pulled out his thermos. It was dented, but the seal had held. He unscrewed the cap, the smell of Earl Grey once again filling the alien air. "I told you, document," It's the tea. And the fact that my planet hates its children. It makes us sturdy. Val's telepathic presence brushed against Elias's mind, but this time it was hesitant, almost reverent. I saw your thoughts, Elias Thorne. I saw the deep waters of your home. I saw the fires and the smog. You do not survive this world because you are strong. You survive it because you have never known a world that was kind. Elias took a long sip of his tea, the warmth spreading through his battered frame. He looked up at the bruising sky, where the extraction shuttle was already a bright spark descending through the atmosphere. Elias said softly, Earth's a right bitch, but she teaches you how to keep your feet when the wind blows. And on a moon like this, that's about all the advantage a man needs. He stood up, dusted off his trousers, and began to walk toward the landing zone. He didn't wait for the scientists. He had a job to finish, and more importantly, he was almost out of tea. Character count for this section: 2,684 total character count. 15,830. The extraction shuttle, a sleek needle of silver and blue, landed with a grace that felt insulting to the jagged terrain of the iron moor. As the ramp lowered, a team of medical droids and Academy observers rushed out, their sensors bristling. They bypassed Elias entirely, swarming Kazun and Val with nutrient sprays and stabilizers. Elias walked past them, his heavy boots clanging on the metal ramp. He found a jump seat in the corner of the cargo bay, away from the bright lights and the frantic chirping of the droids. He sat down and leaned his head back against the cold bulkhead, closing his eyes. Sir. A young Selvan cadet, similar to the Thyrus of the old reports, approached him. The cadet's bioluminescent patches were flickering a nervous, pale yellow. He held a high-tech scanning pad. I need to take your vitals for the incident report. The sensors on the station recorded a localized gravity spike of 2.1 G. My data says you were in the center of it. Elias opened one eye. I'm fine, lad. Just a bit of a stiff neck. The cadet ran the scanner over Elias's chest. He froze. He looked at the pad, then back at Elias, then at the pad again. Your bone density is 4 times the galactic average. And your blood chemistry, it's half saturated with alkaloids and... Is that capsaicin? You have a chemical weapon in your bloodstream. Chili flakes on my sandwich at lunch, Elias muttered, closing his eye again. Don't worry about it. It keeps the parasites away. But the spores, the cadet persisted, his voice rising in pitch. The shadow lung. They were detected in your primary airways. According to the manual, your internal organs should be currently undergoing a process of rapid oxidation. You should be turning into a statue of rust from the inside out. Elias let out a dry, rasping chuckle. He reached out and grabbed the cadet's wrist, his grip gentle but as immovable as the valve he had turned. Listen to me, son. Your manual was written by people who live in houses made of glass on planets that smell like flowers. I come from a place where we eat the things that try to kill us just to see if they taste good with salt. He let go of the cadet and pulled his flat cap over his eyes. Now, unless you've got a fresh kettle of water and some milk, leave a working man to his rest. Character count for this section: 2,519 total character count. 18,349. The shuttle lifted off, the artificial gravity kicking in to smooth out the ascent. Inside the bay, the contrast was stark. The 2 alien scientists were hooked up to machines, their lives sustained by the pinnacle of galactic technology. Elias Thorne, meanwhile, was snoring. A deep rumbling sound that vibrated through the floorboards. To the Selvan cadet, the sound was terrifying, like a predator growling in its sleep. To Elias, it was just the sound of a successful shift. As the shuttle broke the atmosphere of Sigma 9, Xun looked out the viewport. Below them, the iron moor was already being swallowed by the violet clouds of the great rust. In the center of the valley, the nitrogen jet was still roaring, a defiant white flag against the toxic landscape. Beside the relay station, something small and dark caught Xun's eye. It was Elias's flat cap, anchored to a jagged piece of obsidian. It fluttered in the 1.6 G wind, battered by spores and iron rain, refusing to be swept away. Xun turned his gaze back to Elias. The human's face was relaxed in sleep, the lines of penance and grief softened for a moment. We study the stars to find life, Xun whispered to the telepathic Val. We categorize planets by their danger. We build suits to withstand the universe. But we forgot that some life doesn't just withstand the universe. Some life was forged in its heart. Vol didn't respond with words. Instead, he projected a single image into Xun's mind. A small blue planet spinning in a dark corner of the galaxy, surrounded by storms and fire, and a species of small soft-skinned creatures who looked at the apocalypse and decided it was a good place for a cup of tea. The shuttle docked with the Highland beacon, and the heavy doors hissed open. Elias woke up instantly, his eyes clear and alert the moment the pressure changed. He stood up, grabbed his empty thermos and nodded to the scientists. "Good luck with the data, Doc," he said, stepping out onto the station. "Send me the bill if I broke any of your sensors." He walked toward the habitation deck, his gait steady and confident. He had 3 more months on his contract, and according to the weather reports, tomorrow was going to be a real storm. Elias Thorne couldn't wait. He still had a whole tin of ginger biscuits left. Character count for this section, 2,583 total character count. 20,932 the following morning, the Highland Beacon was a hive of activity. The data Elias had recovered from the relay station was being hailed as a breakthrough in extreme environment resource extraction. But while the bureaucrats and scientists celebrated in the upper decks, Elias Thorne was back in the lower engineering bays, where the air was thick with the smell of grease and recycled oxygen. He was sitting on a crate, his hands buried in the guts of a faulty atmospheric scrubber. Beside him sat a small, portable electric kettle he had requisitioned from the galley. It hummed a low, comforting tune as the water approached a boil. "Mr. Thorne." Elias didn't look up from the wiring. "If you're here to tell me I'm trespassing in engineering again, tell the chief I'm fixing his air so he doesn't have to." It wasn't the chief. It was Dr. Xun. The scientist looked different today. His crystalline facets were polished, but he was wearing a heavy, human-made utility vest over his robes. In his hand he held a small clear container. "I am not here to remove you," Xun said, his voice softer than before. "I am here because the Academy has requested a formal debriefing on your biological interaction with the shadowlung spores. They want to know how your immune system neutralized a sentient fungus." Elias paused, his wire cutters hovering over a red lead. He looked at the container Xun held. Inside, a single dormant spore of the shadowlung sat on a bed of nutrient gel. "Neutralized is a strong word, Doc," Elias said, returning to his work. "He has started drinking the black tea. He says it makes his thoughts feel sharper, though his digestive sac has been in a state of constant rebellion for 12 hours. Elias barked a laugh, a loud, genuine sound that echoed through the pipes of the engineering deck. "Tell Vol he's a brave man. Or a stupid one. On Earth, there's not much difference." As Kazun vanished through the hatch, Elias turned back to his workbench. He pulled a small, worn photograph from his pocket. It showed a group of men in orange jumpsuits, grinning in front of a massive underwater welding rig. Elias traced the face of a man standing in the center, his younger brother, who hadn't been quite sturdy enough for the pressure. "Almost there, Joey," Elias whispered. "Just a few more moons." He tucked the photo away, picked up his mug, and walked toward the next flickering light in the corridor. There was always something breaking on the Highland Beacon. Luckily, there was always an Englishman around to fix it. Character count for this section, 2,756 total character count. 26,812 the final month of Elias's contract on Sigma-9 brought the Iron Tempest, a meteorological event that made the Great Rust look like a light drizzle. The moon's atmosphere didn't just thicken. It curdled. The air pressure outside the Highland Beacon spiked to a staggering 2.5 G, and the wind speeds reached 400 kilometers per hour, carrying shards of obsidian and frozen nitrogen. Inside the station, the mood was funereal. The orbital stabilizers were screaming, their cooling systems struggling against the friction of the storm. "The primary comms array is down," Xun reported in the command center. "If we cannot realign the dish manually, we will lose contact with the Union fleet. Without the fleet's guidance, the station's orbit will decay within 6 hours. We will be crushed by the moon we are trying to study." The station commander, a spindly, multi-limbed creature from the core worlds, looked at the external monitors. The view was a chaotic swirl of orange and black. Manually? No suit in the inventory can withstand those wind speeds. The joints would be sheared off. The occupant would be pulverized. Elias Thorne was standing in the back of the room, leaning against the doorframe. He was wearing his heavy canvas coat, now reinforced with strips of silver adhesive tape around the seams. He had his flat cap pulled low, and his heavy boots were double-laced. "I'll go," Elias said. His voice was flat, devoid of bravado. The commander turned, his secondary eyes blinking in shock. "Mr. Thorne, you are a laborer, not a suicidal fool. The gravity alone is 2.5 g out there. That is 2.5 times your homeworld's pull. Your heart will fail under the weight of your own blood." "My heart's been through worse than a bit of gravity," Elias said, pushing off the wall. "And the wind? I've walked the piers in Whitby during a North Sea gale. You just have to lean into it." "You don't understand," Val's telepathic voice interjected. His liquid form agitated within his suit. "The obsidian shards. They are moving at supersonic speeds. They will shred your skin." Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out his last ginger biscuit. He looked at it for a moment, then tossed it into his mouth. "Then I'll just have to move faster than the rocks, won't I?" He turned and headed for the airlock. He didn't wait for permission. He knew that in a galaxy of fragile, brilliant minds, sometimes you just needed a blunt instrument. Character count for this section: 2,642 total character count. 29,454. The airlock cycled, and for a moment, the world simply ceased to exist. The roar of the iron tempest was a physical blow, a wall of sound and pressure that slammed into Elias with the force of a freight train. He was instantly driven to one knee, the 2.5 g gravity trying to pin him to the exterior hull like an insect under a thumb. "Breathe," Elias told himself. "Just breathe." The air was a gritty metallic slurry. Every inhalation felt like swallowing needles, but his lungs, hardened by years of industrial abuse, filtered the oxygen from the chaos. His heart hammered against his ribs, not with fear, but with the violent chemical surges of adrenaline that made his vision sharpen into a predatory clarity. He began to crawl. The obsidian shards hissed past him, some clipping his coat and leaving long, jagged tears in the waxed canvas. One caught him across the cheek, drawing a thin line of red. Elias didn't flinch. The cold, iron-rich blood of Earth was already clotting, his metabolism sealing the wound before the spores could take root. The comms dish was 50 meters away, a skeletal tower of alloy vibrating so hard it hummed a death note. Elias reached the base of the tower and stood up. The wind tried to tear him off the hull. He hooked his arm around a support strut, his muscles screaming in protest. This was it, the limit. His earthborn biology was being pushed to the absolute edge of what carbon-based life could endure. He could feel the calcium in his bones groaning, the microfractures forming in his shins. But Elias Thorne didn't let go. He reached the alignment gear, a massive rusted housing that had been jammed by a chunk of obsidian. He pulled a heavy iron wrench from his belt, a tool he had forged himself in the engineering bay. "Come on, you ugly bitch!" he roared into the storm, the words lost in the howling gale. He slammed the wrench into the gear housing, using his entire body as a lever. The 2.5 g gravity worked against him, but he used it, leaning his massive earth weight into the blow. Clang! The obsidian shattered. The gear groaned, then began to turn. Character count for this section: 2,512 total character count. 31,966. Slowly, the massive comms dish began to rotate, its automated motors finally catching as the obstruction was cleared. Elias watched as the signal light on the base flickered from red to a steady, defiant green. He had done it. But the storm wasn't finished. A sudden gust, a gravity shear peculiar to Sigma 9, slammed into the tower. The support strut Elias was holding onto snapped like a dry twig. He was thrown backward, sliding across the slick, metallic hull toward the edge of the station. Below him was a 3,000-meter drop into the jagged moors of the moon. He clawed at the metal, his fingers leaving deep scores in the alloy, but there was nothing to grip. He reached the edge. His boots slipped into the void. Not like this, he thought, a sudden sharp image of the Yorkshire moors flashing through his mind. "I still have to finish my tea." His hand shot out, catching the edge of a recessed exhaust port. The jolt nearly tore his shoulder from its socket. He hung there, suspended over the abyss, his body a plaything for the 2.5 g gravity and the 400-kilometer winds. His fingers began to slip. The waxed canvas of his coat was slick with iron rain. Suddenly a light flared above him, a bright lavender glow. "Thorn, take my hand." It was Xun. The scientist was leaning out of a maintenance hatch, his crystalline body tethered to the interior by a heavy cable. He looked terrified, his facets dull with the strain of the pressure, but his grip was firm. Elias reached up and grabbed Xun's arm. It felt like grabbing a cold stone pillar. With a heave that made both of them roar in agony, Xun pulled the human back into the hatch. They collapsed onto the interior floor as the hatch slammed shut, sealing out the tempest. For a long time, neither of them moved. They just lay there in the dim emergency lighting, their chests heaving in the sudden blissful silence of the pressurized station. Xun was the first to speak, his voice a series of cracked, dissonant chimes. You are the most irrational, stubborn, and